Okay, so I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, but as we already heard, this last session exists to hear from Brett, but also to have a discussion of the talk. We also certainly want to open it up and have a discussion about the themes of the entire day. And we also just heard from a terrific panel, and because of the inevitable and unavoidable technical delays that come from using a room that's really not equipped for this kind of thing, we didn't have a chance to ask questions to the last two panelists, so we want to have that opportunity too. It's a pleasure to introduce Brett Christophers, who's a professor of human geography at Uppsala University. Brett has worked widely on issues having to do with capitalism, having to do with housing, having to do with urban. Looking at his website, his CV today, it's really just an extraordinary body of scholarship in terms of its breadth and depth. I want to mention two articles he's published in a journal called Critical Historical Studies. One, he's a critical historical studies recidivist. The problem of rent, and also the end of carbon capitalism as we knew it. So I hope you don't mind the plug for our in-house journal, Critical Historical Studies. I heard a lot of great papers today that we would love to see submitted to the journal. He's published many books. I think I'll just mention the last three that he's published only this decade. The first, Rentier Capitalism, Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It, that came out in 2020. Our Lives and Their Portfolios, Why Asset Managers Own the World, 2023. And then most recently, The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Each of these books is really a gem, and I can't say how much I admire the fact that they have a kind of interdisciplinary to them, but interdisciplinary that's worn very lightly. They're books that make contributions to scholarship, but also because of the way in which they're written, they make pointed interventions, very timely interventions into public debates without simplifying or kind of dumbing down the issues. So these are books that have made a splash, and you can see being talked about in the New Left Review, but also in the Financial Times. So this is not an easy feat by any means, and this is something that Brett almost uniquely has been able to accomplish in his career. So it's a pleasure to introduce him. The title of his talk today will be Rentier Capitalism and Neoliberalism in the Age of Climate Change. Brett, please.
So I'm going to get stuck straight into this. So we've been hearing today about all sorts of different ways about trying to kind of capture the contemporary moment. And I guess by the contemporary moment, certainly in my case, I would be referring not just to, the last couple of years, but the last few decades rather than just the last few years. And the particular way in which I've tried to do that is through the idea of rentier capitalism. So I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about that and about what I mean by that, and about more than that, about what I guess hope to achieve with using that idea. And I suppose the first thing to say is that for me, it was and is very much something very simple, by which I mean a way of trying to grasp a set of empirical realities, not least in relation to the United Kingdom, where I'm from, but not only in relation to the United Kingdom over the last recent decades, and kind of grasping for a way of doing that, and failing to find kind of an existing conceptual architecture, for want of a better term, that helped me do that. And it was in trying to do something very, very empirical that I came to rely on this concept or framework or whatever you might want to call it. So obviously, if you want to talk about rentier capitalism, what we're talking about is rent. So the place to start is obviously with the idea of rent. And apologies if what I'm going to say now is something that is obvious to everyone in the room. For those for whom it is obvious, I'm sorry, but I'm imagining there are at least some people for whom it won't be obvious. So it's important to kind of lay this out. So as many of you will know, the idea of rent gets mobilized, invoked, and thought about in innumerable different ways. And so I think a good place to start is to say, well, what are some of the main traditions of thinking about the concept of rent? And I think that we can say that it's not oversimplifying things to say that there are, and for quite a long time been, two main traditions of thinking about rent, of an understanding of rent. So the first of those is the way in which rent is understood within, I guess, what you might call mainstream economics, so orthodox economic thinking. So for orthodox economists, rent is, I think the best way of describing it would be as a form of excess. So if we think about there being kind of a normal or average level of profit that's obtainable in what we can think of as broadly competitive markets, then rent is the excess profit that is available by virtue specifically of an absence of competition. I think is a broadly accurate way of understanding how rent is conceived of in the mainstream tradition. So rent is very much an excess, and I think that's the key word to remember. But on the other hand, there's a whole kind of heterodox tradition of thinking about rent, which thinks about rent very, very differently, where and that tradition is a tradition that goes back to the likes of Ricardo and Marx, where rent is much more about a form of income that is derivable by virtue of ownership of a particular asset, where the classic rent-bearing asset would be land, but where land is not the only form of rent-bearing asset. And those two traditions actually kind of originated from the same place, but for all sorts of interesting historical reasons, they headed off in different directions. And there was a great paper that was published in the journal New Political Economy. I think it was about a year ago by a woman called Beth Stratford, where she gave a fantastic, much deeper explanation of those historical traditions and where they're coming from and why they evolved in the way they did, which I would highly recommend. So if there are the two main traditions of thinking about rent, and when I'm talking about rentier capitalism, I do it with an understanding that, as Eduardo said right at the beginning of the day, if people can remember back that far, where I think about rent as essentially largely within that heterodox tradition, where it's essentially principally about income that's derived through control of scarce assets of one kind or another. But I don't think that the mainstream understanding is completely valueless, to use a pertinent word, because I think that the point about competition is a very, very important one. And so the kind of the tweak that I give it is to say that I think that rent can be usefully understood as income that's derived from control of a scarce asset of some kind, but specifically under conditions of limited competition. And I think that point's an important one, not least because it's quite possible to think about assets that are scarce and owned in a relatively secure way, which might not generate rent because there might be competition in the form of substitute services or substitute products of one kind or another. So I think the point about competition is an important one. So if that is a useful way of thinking about rent, then a rentier is an economic actor for which rent, as understood in that way, is the exclusive or predominant form of income that they enjoy. And in turn, rentier capitalism would be a form of capitalism that is dominated by rent and rentiers to one extent or another. And of course, the question of how you measure that is a perennially very, very difficult one. But the argument I guess I've tried to make is that the UK in recent decades can be thought of as a kind of a quintessentially as a quintessential form or modality of rentier capitalism, insofar as wherever you look in the UK economy, you find streams of income that look very much like rent, as I've just described it. And so one of the things I've tried to do is capture the UK economy empirically in that way by thinking about the different sectors of the economy through the prism of rent. And so again, as Eduardo said at the beginning of the day, a lot of my work has been about trying to look at those different sectors of the economy where rentiers dominate, and obviously finance is one of those. Land and housing is absolutely another, but there are also some very, very important other ones, and I'll mention just two or three of those. So natural resources would be another one. So oil and gas has for a very long time been a very, very important part of the UK economy. Not necessarily a visible part of the economy because so much of it occurs offshore, but it's been central to the UK economy since the late 1970s, and it remains central today. So as I'm sure many of you know, the Conservative government continues to issue licenses for new oil and gas exploration as we speak, despite the International Energy Agency and others having said 5 years ago that we can't have any new oil and gas development if we want to hit various climate targets. So oil and gas and natural resources more generally are very, very important, and another kind of prototypically rentier part of the economy. Intellectual property is another one. So intellectual property particularly in the pharmaceutical sectors, but also in the creative industries and others. And the aerospace industry is very, very central to the British economy. Infrastructure in one form or another. So I was talking about this in the class that we had yesterday, but the UK has arguably gone as far as anyone else in privatizing infrastructures that are essential to the delivery of utility services of various kinds, from water and wastewater to electricity and gas and others, which are now in the hands of various infrastructure rentiers of various types, including the asset managers that Paul was talking about this morning. And then last but not least, digital platforms, which are obviously the I guess the rentier sector that has received a lot of attention from Varoufakis and Cedric Durand and so on through the concept of techno-feudalism, where I think to a significant extent what they're talking about is exactly the same thing, but just using a different terminology to do that, which frankly is completely fine. So I just want to make a couple of points about that understanding of rentier capitalism before moving on. So the first thing to say is that what I'm trying to say by using that concept and working with that concept is absolutely not that what we kind of have is a new form of capitalism that is fundamentally different from what came before. So what I'm not saying is that the contemporary era is a form of rentier capitalism which kind of displaced an explicitly non-rentier form of capitalism. Still less that what we have is a kind of a form of post-capitalism or anything like that. The argument is much more a case about degree rather than kind. And what I mean by that is that I think it's useful to think about rentier capitalism as the intensification of certain dynamics and structures that are integral to capitalism in all its historical and geographical varieties, which is to say that rent has always been and I guess always will be an integral part of what makes capitalism, but those particular rentier elements and rentier dimensions have become much more pronounced in recent decades for a set of reasons that we can think about and debate. So it's not rentier capitalism versus non-rentier capitalism. It's capitalism. Rent is integral to capitalism, but that rentier dimension has become much more pronounced in recent decades. So that's the basic argument there. And it's an argument which is actually not entirely dissimilar from the argument that Piketty makes in his book, I think, although obviously using a very, very different language. The other thing I want to say before moving on is to say a little bit about what I think the main, I guess, political economic consequences have been, specifically in the UK, but arguably more broadly, I know the UK case best, of this intensification of the rentier element of capitalism in recent decades. And I think the first of those is growing inequality. I think that it will be very hard to convincingly explain the growth in inequality in the UK in recent decades without reference to precisely the transformations and dynamics that I've been talking about in terms of rent and rentierization. And I think that's true of both income inequality and in particular wealth inequality. So on the income inequality side, I think that insofar as sectors dominated by rent, as I've described it, are oligopolistic or monopolistic by their very nature, that you tend to see very high levels of concentration and very limited labor power within those specific markets, which means a declining labor share precisely along the lines, again, that Paul was referring to in his talk this morning. But I think even more so in terms of wealth inequality. And again, the reference to Piketty, I think, is a useful one here. So Piketty's entire argument about wealth inequality is arguably an argument about rent, right? And again, we touched on this in the class yesterday, but Piketty's famous R over G formula is essentially, the R is essentially rent. It's return on assets of the various kinds that I've been talking about. And as he argues, if R is greater than G, where G is the rate of economic growth, then you get intensifying wealth inequality. And I think that the UK, in a sense, has been kind of like the perfect laboratory for the working out of that formula, as Piketty posits it, sorry, in recent decades. So I think inequality, and then the other thing, which is connected to it but slightly different, is declining productivity. So in a rentier economy where capitalists are disproportionately focused on the productivity of assets other than labor, labor productivity declines of the kind that the UK has famously seen in recent times, I think precisely what you would expect. And alongside that, I think the kind of stagnation that the UK economy has essentially become accustomed to over the past 2 or 3 decades, but particularly the last 2 decades, again, is precisely what you would expect in an economy where rentiers dominate and where they are focused much more on sweating and extending the lifetime of existing rent-bearing assets than innovating in the service of growing labor productivity and the like. So I think that what we've seen in the UK economy in terms of outcomes, in terms of productivity declines and stagnation of growing inequality are exactly what you would expect theoretically in an economy dominated by rent. One thing I think that it might be interesting to mention when I'm talking about stagnation is that some would argue that that stagnation, and again, this was something that came up in David's class yesterday, that stagnation was already systemic by the 1970s, not least within the UK economy, but not only within the UK economy. And people would therefore go on to argue from that actually to talk about rentier capitalism and the growth of rent and rentiers as being the source of stagnation is to kind of get the relationship between chicken and egg the wrong way around, which is to say that the turn to rent and rentiers and what I've been describing as rentier capitalism was actually much more the result of economic stagnation rather than the cause of economic stagnation. And I think lots of people would argue that. I don't think that those two arguments are necessarily incompatible. You could very well argue that stagnation leads to a transformation of the economy that then reinforces that stagnation. So I don't essentially have a view on that point one way or another, but I think it's a point that's worth making. There's untold arguments about falling rates of profit and over accumulation and so on that where people do make those arguments. To be personally, I've never been entirely convinced by those arguments, either conceptually or empirically. I tend to prefer arguments that would see what happened in the 70s and the turn towards the new scheme of things more as a result of things like growing competition internationally and declining labor shares than falling rates of profits. But be that as it may, that argument is there. Now, what is also widely seen within the literature, within the political economy literature, as having been a result of growing stagnation in the global north in the 60s and 70s is of course what we now call neoliberalism. And so what I wanted to now was talk relatively briefly about neoliberalism, which is obviously a term that has also been used very, very widely, not least in my discipline of geography, to capture the essence, the political economic essence of recent decades. And the way I want to talk about this is to say that, for me at least, to talk about rentier capitalism is absolutely not to kind of posit that as a framing that represents an alternative to neoliberalism. for me at any rate, they are complementary understandings. And so the way I'd like to put it is to say that neoliberalism can be thought of as the kind of soil within which rentier capitalism germinates. It can be thought of as the sort of assemblage of policies and ideologies and practices, but policies in particular that have enabled or driven that intensification of rent that I was talking about earlier. So neoliberalism, the advent of neoliberalism, the rise of what we have come to talk about as neoliberalism has been what has put in place the conditions for rentiers to thrive, is another way of putting it. And that's the way I like to think about it. So I want to talk very, very briefly about what I see as the four main dimensions of neoliberalism that have done that have enabled the intensification of rent. And actually, when Radhika was talking earlier, I think there's a lot of overlap between what she was positing there in terms of what the essence of neoliberalism actually is and what I want to talk about. So the first of those four is simply privatization. So, and again, this speaks to my focus on my disproportionate focus on the UK and so far as privatization has gone so far in the UK. But obviously, if you privatize lots of assets, then you create more assets on which private sector actors are able to generate rents, all other things being equal. And so the UK is a classic case of that, where from the beginning of the 80s, you had mass privatization of land and housing, mass privatization of infrastructures, of utility infrastructures of various kinds. And you also have mass privatization of natural resources. So obviously, if you go back to the 1970s, BP, British Petroleum, was in large part a public sector organization. And so privatization is arguably the central part of the story whereby neoliberalism has kind of given the rentier its ability to flourish, its ability to breathe. Privatization is the first then. I think the second one, very, very important, is the strengthening and actually the extension as well of various forms of private property rights. So it's all very well having ownership of economic assets of various kinds, but if you don't have strong rights to those assets, your ability to securely extract rent from them is likely to be impaired by virtue of not having those strong rights. So we can look at a domain like intellectual property, for example, and see that throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and indeed up to today, we've seen a massive strengthening and extension of private property rights to intellectual property, whereby the ability of the owners of those properties to extract income by virtue of that ownership has been reinforced, because the rights to it, not least the rights in terms of the ability to resist antitrust intervention, but also the extension of those rights to new forms of intellectual property, has really massively enabled that, alongside greater tools of enforcement of intellectual property rights. So the strengthening and extension of private property rights is the second one. The third one is, and very, very important, and this is where Piketty puts a lot of his focus, is obviously taxation. So a big part of Piketty's story, the whole a lot of the reason why R was greater than has become greater than G for Piketty is about the kind of increasingly friendly taxation policies globally vis-a-vis wealth and assets. So the general dampening of capital gains tax, for example, across the world on a general level, but also specific taxation policies within the oil and gas sector, within the pharmaceutical sector, within the creative industries, all of which have enabled the rentiers that own the relevant assets to extract income from them to a much greater degree than would otherwise be able. And of course, taxation policy is significant in terms of encouraging individuals and institutions to get into the rentier business in the first place. For example, you would not buy residential property to let if the income that you were going to derive from that was going to be onerously taxed. So taxation policy it shapes things as well as impacting the outcomes in terms of the ability to extract that rent. So favorable taxation is the third one. And then the fourth one that I think is worth pointing to is policies that are conducive to asset price inflation. And again, and I think consistently over recent decades, we have seen policies that that do that. Quantitative easing in the 2010s was kind of the classic case of that. But you know, I'm sure everyone in the room is quite aware that even though quantitative easing is now a part of history, global asset markets are nonetheless scaling all-time highs. So we simply have a different set of interventions, which I'm happy to talk about later, which again have continued to reinforce asset price inflation, which is obviously a rentier-friendly story. Okay, now the connection to between neoliberalism, part of the reason I made that connection, want to talk about that connection, is that I think it makes this in particular a very timely moment to reconsider the question of rentier capitalism, and I want to do that in the remainder of of the time that I have, particularly with a view to what Eduardo and Nico and Daniel wanted with this conference, which, as Michael said, is to kind of speculatively look forward rather than look back. So that's what I want to do right now. And the reason I say that is that the last couple of years in particular have seen many different commentators, but also I guess also some policymakers as well, but in particular commentators, pronounce the death of neoliberalism. Now, people have been doing that for a long time, but my impression, at least, is that the confidence with which people have been doing that in the last year or two is on a different order of things than happened previously. For example, around the time of the financial crisis, when it was very speculative pronouncements, but the likes of Adam Tooze and others have been very, very forceful in the last couple of years, saying, no, we have entered a new scheme of things. And actually, John, I think in your question that you asked to the first panel this morning, we're asking them to reflect on precisely this question, which is a question of, well, can we think of the last 2 to 3 years as representing a significant shift? So the place where I want to start is I guess with the question of what has led commentators to make those pronouncements in the last couple of years. And I think, unless I'm completely misreading things, which is entirely possible, it seems to me that if there's one thing above all which have led people to come to that conclusion, it's the revival of US industrial policy, much more than anything else. It's the renewed willingness of the US government to, I wouldn't say pick winners, but to actively engage in industrial policy in a way that had not occurred in the US, but also in large parts of Western Europe for a long time, actively and willingly, and by their very own admission. And that, there have been famous speeches, like Jake Sullivan gave a speech in which he talked to, where he talked about, we were wrong to rely upon market mechanisms to allocate resources to the extent that we did. And so these have become, very symbolic moments for those who have said that we have entered this new scheme of things. So Bidenomics, the move away from markets first, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the reasons that I think that I personally find that interesting is that in the book that I wrote about rentier capitalism, the potential revival of industrial policy was something that I identified as one possible axis of a kind of, I wouldn't say anti-rentier, but if one wants to think about the potential ways in which policymakers could intervene to move an economy that has become very dominated by rent and rentiers in a different direction, then active industrial policy would be one of those. So I talked about that in the book, steering investment away from rentier type activities as one potential way to stem rentier dominance. And another one I talked about in the book was more active antitrust. So again, as everyone in the room knows, the period from the 1980s until very, very recently, particularly in the US, but not only in the US, has been has been kind of one long period of defanging of antitrust law under the influence of those who operated in the hallowed halls of Chicago as much as anywhere else, the Robert Borks and so on. But again, as with the case of industrial policy, there has been in the guise of the new the FTC in the US in particular, a move back to a more interventionist antitrust policy. There's lots of opposition to that, but I think that quite a lot of significant work is occurring in that direction under Lena Khan. And again, that was something else I pointed to in the book. And so in a way, you might say that given that those are two things I pointed to in the book, that I would be sympathetic to those arguments that what we are seeing is a move in a new direction. But what I want to do now to kind of push back about that is to look at, I guess, what represents the cause célèbre of those that have been making arguments in this direction and of the new industrial policy, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which came into force 18 months ago, I think, something along those lines in the US, and in particular the centerpiece of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the reinforcement of the support mechanisms for investment in renewable energy in the US. So investment in solar and wind and batteries, and other forms of renewable energy infrastructure in the US. And the reason I want to do that is that when you look at what's actually going on with the Inflation Reduction Act and what constitutes it, and in particular in relation to that centerpiece, the renewables credits, I think that it potentially gives us grounds to take pause. And so I want to point to three particular things about that. So the first of those is that the assets, the core assets that the Inflation Reduction, I can't say IRA because when I grew up, the IRA meant something completely different. The core assets that the Inflation Reduction Act serves to subsidize investment in are classic rent generating assets. So solar and wind assets are nothing if not rent generating assets where once you've installed them, the amount of labor power that is required to actually continue to operationalize those assets is very, very, very limited, which, as an aside, is something that I think, the arguments about the Green New Deal being labor generating instruments have not quite fully reckoned with. It's a little bit the elephant in the room. I think the labor implications of the shift to renewable energy. But be that as it may, these are classic rent generating assets, which is precisely why some of the biggest owners and investors in those assets are asset managers, classic rentier institutions. Where I live in Scandinavia, if you drive around the Swedish or Norwegian countryside and you happen upon a wind farm in the middle of nowhere, the odds are very, very good that BlackRock is the owner of that wind farm. I think it's the largest owner of wind farms in Scandinavia today, and Brookfield, another big asset manager in the real asset space, I think is either the biggest or second biggest owner of renewable energy assets globally. So these are rent generating assets, the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that the Inflation Reduction Act is nothing if not a set of subsidies to private capital. So there are provisions to private rentier capital. So there are provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act for enabling public sector actors to invest in renewable energy assets, so-called direct pay provisions. But the initial evidence, at least, is that there are very few instances of that occurring, and I think there are very good reasons for that. So at the end of the day, the Inflation Reduction Act will end up subsidizing investment in renewable energy that is almost entirely private investment rather than public sector investment by private rentiers. And then the third thing, which goes back to one of the things I was talking about earlier about the neoliberal crutches to rentier capitalism, is that the mechanism is taxation. These are tax credits, these are tax subsidies of essentially precisely the same type that have been used across all manner of different sectors in subsidizing rentier capital over recent decades. All of which is to say that it seems to me that if you look at the details of the Inflation Reduction Act, that this is kind of straight out of the playbook of what I've been thinking, what I've been talking about as rentier capitalism and its neoliberal underpinnings. I literally don't see anything substantially different about that than the dispensation of recent decades. Now, in the limited time I have available still, I want to broaden this out to, I guess, the climate crisis more generally, to make a couple of what I think are relatively straightforward and hopefully uncontroversial points. And the way I want to do that is to say that, to a significant extent, as an economic phenomenon, and it's obviously so much more than that, as a macroeconomic phenomenon at any rate, the climate crisis is in large measure an infrastructure crisis. And what I mean by that is that it's a crisis of infrastructure investment. So both climate mitigation and adaptation, but particularly mitigation, are issues of investment in infrastructure of various kinds. And the reason I say that is that with the Inflation Reduction Act, but also more broadly, not just within the US, but across the rest of, I think, the Western world, and China, I think, is the big exception to this, which is worth thinking about and talking about. There has been no change in the modus operandi of how that infrastructure investment is occurring and how it is being thought about and planned and modeled. We live in a world of intensified fiscal discipline and fiscal conservatism, where the idea that briefly kind of flowered with the very early Green New Deal ideas from Sanders on this side of the Atlantic and the Corbyn team on the other side of the Atlantic, that you might see substantial public sector investment in energy infrastructures, but also other infrastructures, has long disappeared in that environment of fiscal conservatism. And so the modus operandi today is precisely what it has been for the last 30 or 40 years, which is essentially about, to the extent that the state invests, it invests purely in subsidizing or de-risking private investment in that infrastructure, rather than investing in revenue generating assets that are owned by the public sector itself. And actually, I would, just going back to something I was saying earlier, it strikes me that those mechanisms of de-risking of private infrastructure investment are a substantial part of the current set of policies that are conducive to asset price inflation around the world today. That approach of de-risking private sector infrastructure investment is, again, I think, a form of classic rentier capitalism. And I think you can make exactly the same argument about what I at least would consider one of the other great kind of investment crises of today, which is the housing crisis. It's exactly the same story around the world, where, to the extent that public funds are going into the necessary investment in housing infrastructure, it is almost entirely about subsidizing and de-risking private sector investment, again by asset managers in large part, but not only by them, rather than public housing. And so the very last thing I want to say is that if we think about what's been going on in those terms, with the focus on the Inflation Reduction Act, but not only the Inflation Reduction Act, as the kind of cause célèbre of those who argue that something fundamentally has changed, it seems to me that you could only argue, and this is where I think Radhika was going, but didn't have time to actually get there, was that you could only really argue that neoliberalism is dying or has died if you have an incredibly narrow reading of what neoliberalism is and was. Like, sure, if you think that neoliberalism was entirely about, a reification of market mechanisms, then the shift towards a more interventionist industrial policy might prefigure a significant shape of things. But if you think about everything else that surely was and is central to what we've come to think of as neoliberalism, then it's very, very hard to see that anything really, really significant has changed. Neoliberalism always was about much, much more than the elevation of market mechanisms. I think that I think the dominance of kind of intellectual historians within the debate about neoliberalism has unduly kind of elevated that emphasis on market mechanisms. But it was always about much more than that. And so it seems to me that with what is referred to as Bidenomics, it's much closer to more of the same than to something substantially different. But I could be completely wrong about that. But that's my sense. And again, that sense is based upon specifically on the stuff I've been doing about rentier capitalism. So I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, thank you. So now the floor is open both for questions to Brett about his talk or just kind of comments or reflections about what we discussed throughout the day. I would like to hear from Michael Hudson too, although I think it might be difficult given the technology. So I think instead I'd like to first pass the microphone to Radhika to get your response to the talk. And you can say anything you like. But I also noted the kind of resonances between your talk and Brett's talk. But I also wonder if the concept of rentier capitalism that we heard from Brett, but also Michael, to what degree, if I heard you right, your understanding of monopoly capitalism as kind of most characterizing the moment in which we live, and perhaps kind of the most fundamental underlying tendencies of capitalism as a whole, if you kind of see rentier capitalism as a different term for the same phenomenon you were describing, or if you actually see different dynamics being in play that perhaps can't be captured through the concept of rent or rentier capitalism. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with your, please, yeah, with your comment, and then we can open it up.
Yeah, so first of all, I just wanted to say that I was very pleased to hear Brett's talk because contrary to my impressions earlier, because I have read some of your work, there's a lot more agreement between us than I thought. I mean, I thought there was substantial agreement, but I thought there were also important differences, but now I can't remember them. But let me just say that to answer both of your questions. So my comment that I would like to make about Brett's talk, I'll go first, and then I'll come back to the question of rentier versus monopoly capitalism. So I actually, in my book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, I've elaborated this argument, but I've been making it for decades now. Well, certainly for a decade, maybe more than one decade. Neoliberalism is fundamentally wrong in the sense that it is a wrong description of reality. Okay, it does not describe the economic reality. That the economy does best when you have free markets, et cetera, nor is it correct that competitive capitalism still exists. So in that sense, it was never going to correspond to any, applying it was never going to work. And because applying it was never going to work, it had to constantly shift shape. And that's what we've seen it do about once a decade over the last 40 plus years. So first you got classic neoliberalism of the Reagan and Thatcher type. And I would say that it was a kind of, shall we say, I hate to be complimentary to them, but I think let's just say that, imagine that they genuinely believe that opening up, deregulating, privatizing, all these things, making taxation regressive, et cetera, would actually help revive the economy. But by the end of that decade, it was quite clear that it was not working. And even the IMF and the World Bank were beginning to say that, the state has to play a role, et cetera. In the 1990s, you got allegedly left-of-center governments taking power, the Blairs and the Clintons and so on, and they produced a new discourse. They essentially said to their mainly working-class constituents, we would love to give you higher wages, more benefits, expand the welfare state, increase your rights, increase regulation, etc. But you know what? Our hands are tied. Our hands are tied because of globalization. So that was the globalization decade of the 1990s. In the 2000s, you got the US hegemony, US rules, etc. decade. Ironically, just when the US economy was performing the worst ever and only limping along because of the massive asset inflation that they had created. In the 2010s, you got austerity. And now after COVID, etc., we have what I call pseudo-civic capitalism. And that corresponds to what Brett was saying earlier, which is that the whole thing is essentially about giving capital lucrative contracts to supply what we all allegedly need, whether it is medicines or infrastructure or green energy or whatever. So you essentially give corporations massive subsidies, sweet contracts, PPP deals or PFI deals, whatever you call them, etc. And that's going to be the shape of the future. And that was where I was going initially. And then I realized that there's actually a darker possibility that in the process of giving this, you might actually end up having forces come to power like the Trumps and the Johnsons of this world, who actually represent something even worse, a more authoritarian form of capitalism. But the one thing that will not have changed throughout all of these decades, that it's all about giving big monopoly capital more and more freedom, which does not achieve any significant economic improvement, but it allows this type of capitalism to thrive. So that's the way I look at it. That is, you have had different versions, but the essence is the same. And the essence is not markets, it's not competition, it's the power of big monopoly corporations. Now we come to rentier capitalism. So, you know, I was listening with interest when Brett said that he's not sure that financialization has created low growth. I agree with him. I think it's a kind of chicken and egg thing. The crisis of the 1970s already was a crisis in which, for whatever reason, whether it's falling profits or saturated demand or whatever it may be, capitalists have not been investing. If they're not investing, and when I say investing, not investing productively. If you're not investing productively, what do? You're not going to sow your dollars in a mattress. No, you're going to put it in banks to earn financial interest and so on. And the capitalist world is awash with this kind of money. Mark Carney, when he was still governor of the Bank of Canada, was already complaining that big corporations were sitting on absolutely piles of cash that they were not investing productively. This still remains true. Markets are going up while the economy is tanking. Why? Because there's so much money sloshing about in the system. It's got to go somewhere. So we have apparently got an everything bubble right now. It's not just a housing bubble or a commodities bubble. It's an everything bubble. Every possible type of asset is inflated in value because people have got to put their money somewhere. Rich people, obviously, not you and me. So in that sense, then, to come back to the point, I would say that so what I've argued is that what I call neoliberal financialized capitalism is the only kind of capitalism you can have today. It's a bit like Ford. He said you can have any color of car you like so long as the color you like is black. You can have any kind of capitalism you like so long as the one you like is neoliberal financialized capitalism. Now you call it rentier, but no other form of capitalism is possible. That's why I made the link to Marx monopoly, Marx socialism, etc. I think that we have been keeping capitalism alive well past, decades past its sell-by date. Okay, and we have, and in the golden age period, what we saw was not the miracle of capitalism; it was the miracle of the socialistic reforms we had made to capitalism, which put capitalism on better behavior. This is also corroborated by many of the things that have been said by various people, which is that we had a more progressive taxation, we had better regulation, because capitalism was on its back foot. It had just caused the biggest crisis in the world, including 2 world wars, a Great Depression. It was not, very popular. And that's why these reforms were necessary and possible. So we had that, and 4 decades of neoliberalism have shown us that if you do what capital wants, which is give it more freedom, and we do it because capitalism is in power. Capital is in power. We're giving it what it wants. This is what you get. You're not going to get anything different. And we are not, the moment we return to a more industrially dynamic capitalism, or the only way of returning to a more industrially dynamic capitalism, is to impose greater regulation on capital in a way that takes away its freedom. That is already going to be a pretty revolutionary move. And let me say one more thing. I entirely agree. I've made the same argument about industrial policy in my book. That is, the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to lead to any viable industrial policy. But consider this. Every successful example of industrial policy, whether it is in late 19th century Germany or South Korea in the 20th century or Taiwan, etc., Japan for that matter, have all been instances in which for one reason or another, one historical reason or another, the capitalist class does not have complete freedom. It had somebody else's will imposed upon it, whether it was a foreign power or your own Juncker landlord class or whatever it may be. It was not completely in power. The moment you and in the case of China, because you have essentially a socialist government in power, it will limit the prerogatives of capitalism. So I think that we can move towards a system where we will have capital. We may even have big capital, but it cannot have political power. That's the key. So those were my answers.
But do you want to respond or add anything? Okay, good. Thank you. So I see a hand here.
I just have a comment about Brett's talk. You know, I
Okay,
wish
are you
someone
able
would
to
do a
hear me?
study of the solar panel policy in California, because it is exactly as you described. Homeowners get tax breaks for putting solar panels on their rooftops, creating a situation in which the renters are basically subsidizing like my solar panels because their utilities costs have gone up while mine have gone to zero. So in fact, rather than have, and this is Gavin Newsom, a Democratic state. So rather than having a real industrial policy about converting to green energy, we have financialized through taxation, we have subsidized homeowners to create even more, I guess it's profit. I don't pay electricity, but it hurts renters. It's perfect rentier capitalism, and it is not sustainable in terms of labor policy because the panels are made in China. They're installed once. So there's no, and it is absolutely not sustainable as a replacement for electricity in California, even though we have sun, 360 days of a year. So it's a perfect demonstration of how the privatization and taxation subsidies within even green capital in a democratic state produce just more instruments of rentier capitalism. The other thing is they give you you can get tax subsidies for the loans you take out, and I got huge tax deductions from the initial installation from both federal government and state. So we're starving the state and creating an illusion of renewable energy that is actually promoting this kind of capitalism that you're talking about.
Collect a few comments and then come back, Eduardo. I don't know if we're.
I'm following that. There's one message on Zoom, but we can come back to that. in a second.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we'd like to include Michael, but it might just be tough.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, both of you, for the talks, which I thought were fantastic. I had a question about rent for each of you. First, to Radhika, your definition of rent, from what I understood, excludes the feudal obligations. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what is the yield of this definition, because we talked about narrow definitions of capitalism. Morozov says that all this talk about neo-feudalism is because some people have narrow definitions of capitalism. Brad talked about narrow definitions of neoliberalism. And I was wondering if that definition of rent is not too narrow. So that would be my question for you. And question for Brett. I know you're not a medievalist, but I was wondering if you would consider those feudal obligations a kind of rent.
How about one more and then we'll
Thanks. So Brett, I think I agree that nothing has fundamentally changed in the last few years, but I just wanted to get your take on 2 or 3 things that have happened since, let's say, the start of the COVID pandemic. So the dollar has lost 20% of its value, at least since 2020 in the last 4 years. So we've seen this huge inflation that has not taken place ever before in the neoliberal period. Since the 1970s, we haven't seen inflation like this. And we have enormous fiscal stimulus. The IRA is part of that, but the government's budget has just ballooned to completely unsustainable levels, and that's largely what's keeping the economy going and out of recession, along with immigration. And then finally, the higher interest rates that the central bank has brought about to respond to both the fiscal stimulus and the higher inflation. So I'm wondering where those factors just fit in the picture of what's been happening in the last few years.
Do you want to? I thought you were going to gather a few.
Well, let's hear from you now.
So on, would I consider it a form of rent? I guess on based on the definition that I work with, yeah, I probably would. But I haven't really given that any thought at all. On the last few years, I mean, I think that it feels a little bit like it's particularly in terms of the noises that are coming out now. And then what I mean by that is in terms of kind of the expectation of there not being a reduction of interest rates anytime soon. It feels to me like it's almost a return to the determination to kind of have high real interest rates that you basically had from the late 70s all the way through until the financial crisis, which was absolutely fundamental to the asset price inflation that you had during that period. So it looks very, very different from obviously from what we've been used to over the last decade, but I'm not entirely sure that it's fundamentally different to what we had in the 2 or 3 decades prior to that. That would be my initial take on that. But I think that, you know, the interesting thing about, for me at least, about the higher interest rates is that, particularly in terms of the connection to some of the stuff that I was talking about in terms of government subsidization of investment in infrastructure, is that one of the interesting things, if you look at what's and you might be aware of this because you said you've been looking at some of the stuff around real assets, but if you look at what's been happening in infrastructure investment in the last 18 months or so, you know, market indices for infrastructure companies have tanked over the the infrastructure market has died in the last 18 months or so, and that's entirely because of high interest rates, right? So infrastructure is not generally a very high yielding asset class. You know, you might get 5-6%, but it's a regular year, and 5-6% look great when interest rates was 0 or 1%, but 5 to 6% doesn't look so great when interest rates are 5 or 6%, and that's a massive problem for infrastructure investment these days. And it feels to me like the big infrastructure investors, that, you know, not least among the asset managers, the BlackRocks and the Brookfields and the Macquaries, they're kind of just waiting for government to sweeten the deal even further. Basically, there's an expectation there that governments will get desperate because the infrastructure investment is not occurring, not least in renewable energy, but not only in renewable energy, and they're just expecting that that governments will come to the table and sweeten the deal even more than they already have.
So I'll read this out.
So if we use David Harvey's definition of neoliberalism, the class project, I think we avoid the ideology of neoliberalism, that the project was marketization. I'm curious to hear Brett's thoughts on if and how neoliberalism as a class project might be incorporated into the concept of rentier capitalism. Could rentier capitalism be considered an institutional architecture articulated by a specific segment of the capitalist class? I feel like this is somewhat implicit in the concept, but I'm curious to hear his thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ironies for me is it always felt like one of the best and most useful ways of thinking about neoliberalism was one of the first, which was kind of Harvey's, which, you know, now it feels like a long time ago, but it came before a lot of the stuff within intellectual history. And I think that he got a lot absolutely right. And so there's certainly nothing in what Harvey wrote in that book, The Brief History of Neoliberalism, and in terms of his understanding of it, that that I think is incompatible with what I have written about rentier capitalism? Absolutely not. I mean, I think that when he talks about it, he talks about precisely the same dimensions that I talked about earlier in terms of privatization, in terms of strengthening of private property rights. Those are and generous tax policy. Those are exactly the things that he talks about in that book. So I think it's entirely, to my mind, it's entirely compatible. But obviously, it's about if for him, it's about the restoration of the power of the capitalist class. The only, I guess, the twist that you would put on it if you're thinking about it from the perspective that I am, is that it's the restoration of the power of the capitalist class, which today in the UK is predominantly a rentier capitalist class. But I think in the UK that's been the case for quite a long time. Rentier capitalism is not something that's kind of emerged out of nowhere in the UK case. The rentier has very deep historical and institutional cultural roots in the UK. So it was more a kind of return of the rentier than the emergence of something entirely new. So no, I think that the point about Harvey is a really, really good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the other one.
Okay.
I can wait. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to answer your question, Eduardo, and I also want to come back to the point that you raised. So my answer to your question about rent, you said that it's not, yeah. So am I not making too narrow a definition? Well, it seems to me that, as I say, if you say that profit is the characteristic form of surplus extraction in capitalism, then the corresponding term in feudalism would not be rent. It would be feudal dues. And as I say, the way I think rent has emerged is as a result of the class struggle between landlord and serf, so to speak. But secondly, I would also say that rent is a specifically capitalist category. I think I'm not wrong, but rent involves alienable land. Because what is the value of land? This is the capitalized value of the rent you will receive on it, right? So in that sense, and secondly, rent and interest are deductions from productive incomes, which are profits and wages. And as I say, secondarily, government revenues. And that's what we see happening. So in that sense, I don't believe it's too narrow a definition. And then I just wanted to say that, about what has happened in the last couple of years, you talked about inflation and fiscal stimulus and the rise in interest rates. I just want to say that the return of inflation in one level is part of a larger, you had big inflation in the 1970s. That was a crisis of imperialism as well as capitalism, and we have another today. And that comes arise because we did not have low inflation in between, because Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke were such maestros in orchestrating the economy. It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the fact that both working people and the third world they had their incomes deflated essentially. And therefore, they were not able to demand prices. And that situation is now changing. And I don't think inflation is going anywhere. That's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that if you plot, and you can do this on the Federal Reserve website, if you can plot inflation, the graph of inflation, with the graph of the federal effective interest, whatever it's called, interest rate, yeah, the effective federal funds rate. If you plot those two together, what you will see is that even now with 5% plus interest rates, the Federal Reserve is much more tolerant of inflation than it was back in the Volcker's day. Volcker essentially said, I'm going to constrict money supply, and I don't care where interest rates go. And they ended up in double digits, nearly 18, 20%, whatever they became for a brief time. But that's how and then he induced a recession. Powell cannot do that. Not because he cares about the economy. He doesn't care. In fact, he wants to create a recession which will reduce wages, which will discipline workers, etc. But he dare not do that. Why? Because increasing interest rates much beyond the point they have already reached will prick the everything bubble. And once it pricks the everything bubble, the wealth of all those to whom he really owes his allegiance, not you and me, the wealth of his friends will decline massively. Paul Volcker didn't have to worry about that. But these guys have created that asset bubble upon which the wealth rises. And remember, last time, this has happened once before. In the run-up to 2008, the Federal Reserve was forced to increase interest rates. And if you look at the chart of interest rates, you will see the same pattern, quarter percent, whatever, little by little, they increased it. It only had to go to 5.25% before it pricked the housing and credit bubbles. Today, we are already there. They dare not go much higher. They are tolerating a lot of inflation. And that will, of course, so either the dollar will lose its value because there will be a big financial crisis. And if you avoid that, then fine, it is losing its value anyway because of it.
I just wanted to follow up on something Radhika said and ask you to maybe hum a few more bars about what you meant about taking away capitalism's political power. Because on the one hand, you say emphatically that there are ways in which capitalism has passed its expiration date. But on the other hand, from what I understood, rightly or wrongly, from your presentation, was this emphasis on monopoly capitalism and presumably the problematic overcoming of competition and the decline of productive investment. But one might think if the problem is monopoly capitalism, then one could redo the New Deal. One could redo, make American capitalism great again through emphatic state intervention, regulation, antitrust, perhaps above all, in which case it wouldn't be the overcoming of capitalism, but the rejuvenation of a mixed economy or an embedded capitalism. So when you say taking away capital's political power, I was just hoping you could clarify exactly what you meant with respect to that confusion I had from your talk.
We'll take one more. Daniel, go ahead. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so I have a couple questions, and I guess feel free to discard them if they're off on the wrong path. But one is about a common feature I perceived in both of your accounts. So, Radhika, you were talking about Hilferding on German and Anglo models of capitalism, and he wasn't the only one to talk about this. Many people talk about this. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, he wasn't the only one to talk about the competition between German and Anglo models of capitalism. And historically, obviously, the Anglo model won. That's the story there. So to contrast being finance, investing on production, dominating industry, but also eventually merging with industry in a productive way, making those gains through production. The Anglo one being, lend speculatively and make asset gains unproductively. Okay. So Brett, you also said the UK, is the quintessential form of rentier capitalism, and expect stagnation in an economy where rentiers dominate. So my question is, if this is just capitalism, then why does it look like to me what happened historically, politically, is that a certain form of capitalism won a political struggle? That's how it seems to me. And I wonder what you think about that. And if it's on the wrong path, feel free to discard it. The other one is about the idea that just deductions from surplus value, which is, basically aggregate profit formed through growth in Marx's formulation. Now, I don't mean this to criticize Marx. I'm not an anti-Marxist. On the contrary. But one thing maybe he couldn't have pictured is the idea that, you'd have immense automation and then stagnation. And then, you'd have something where you're not getting those gains, redistribution gains, rent and interest through, deductions of surplus value. But actually, it's just a kind of way of capturing extant wealth. And then, then we might not be able to say rent and interest are just portions of surplus value. If it's not, if there isn't growth, then it could be, a shrinking pie, getting a bigger piece of a shrinking pie. So I just wonder, can we be so sure that, rent and interest are just portions of surplus value? So those are my questions.
Okay. So I'll take your question first. So taking away the power of capital, I think that if I had to describe, like if I had to define capitalism, it would not necessarily be vis-a-vis markets or competition. It would have to be that you have a class of capitalists which have political power. So the state does what they want to do. So one way of describing it is, why do I not call China capitalist? Because yes, there are lots of capitalists in China. Yes, they are very big. Some of them are very big, very powerful, etc. But unlike in the West, they don't hold the reins of state power. The party state does, and it regulates them. So that's the way I understand it. So what do I mean by taking away the power of capital? It would be to get at least to roughly where China is, that we tell capitalists what they do. We call them on the carpet when they do things that we don't want them to do, etc. So that would be, and when I say we, I mean, ideally a democratic state, but there have also been forms of state which have imposed its will on capital, which have not been progressive. So South Korean state, for example, etc. The New Deal did not actually dethrone the power of capital. That was its problem. So that's why, although it was responsible for many policies, it actually did not pull the United States out of recession. It was out of the Great Depression. It was the war. Within about 4 years, Roosevelt had lost his nerve. Enough capitalists put enough pressure on him to say, don't continue. He did not continue. The economy tanked again and only picked up again after during the war. And the war was an exceptional situation in which capital was, had to do the bidding of the state for a short period of time. Although at the end of the war, capitalism regained its power. So the war was the exceptional situation, not the New Deal. So I think that's what we would have to go about. And the question of German and Anglo model, you are so right. So on the one hand, yes, the Anglo model won, but it won, but its victory can never be stable. So it is always going to be volatile, crisis prone. So just the other day, I was giving another lecture and I just pulled this graph off Wikipedia and showed it. So you see the number of financial crises that are very high in the pre-war period. Then for about 3 decades after the Second World War, they are next to no financial crisis. And then with the onset of neoliberalism, they are even greater sort of thing. So it is intensely volatile. It is crisis prone. It is also for the United States began to revert to an Anglo model much more from the 1970s onwards, which has also coincided with the deindustrialization of the United States, etc. So going back to the high point of capitalism, I think that if it had not been for the fact that the European powers had destroyed one another by fighting one another and thereby given the United States its unique moment of international power, we would have had a different situation of regional capitalisms, each competing with one another and either, having more wars or eventually, because they remain regional, particularly, or, that would have helped matters, converted into some form of socialism. I think that's what might have happened. But I agree with you. And Michael and I wrote a paper called Beyond the Dollar Creditocracy, in which we do talk about this odd, turn of events. And then rent and interest. Are there deductions from surplus value? And you mentioned automation in this regard. I mean, if you have higher automation, actually surplus value goes up. Just because you don't employ a lot of people doesn't necessarily mean you're not making a lot of surplus value. Okay, so and rent and interest being deductions from profit, essentially, or wages or other incomes derived from productive labor, is just the definition, I think. I mean, there is no, to me, that's what they are. And by the way, this definition is true in the sense that if you continue to run down the economy, the productive economy, eventually there will be no income for you to skim off as financial capital. The artificially created money, whatever you want to call it, the Federal Reserve creating under quantitative easing trillions of dollars worth of new money, only served to fill the black holes that were the bank's balance sheets. It did not actually enter the real economy. Had it done so, we would have had inflation much earlier. So I just want to say that, so I think that yeah, so the fact that there is less and less productive activity does have implication. That was part of the reason why I was asking one of the earlier speakers, I can't see him right now, but at what stage did financial capital start buying up productive, asset managers start buying up productive assets directly? Because in the past, they were free to just buy titles to the incomes from that productive. But now they are down to owning those things because that is the only thing that actually makes an income. So, yeah.
I don't have a huge amount to add to that. I mean, why did the Anglo model win? It's a big question that I'm not smart enough to be able to answer. But I have a very if you're going to force me to make an answer, I've got a very kind of simple and I guess quite cynical answer to that question, which would be because the Anglo model promises maximal levels of wealth inequality. And I'm in Sweden. I live in Sweden. If you look at the history of how Swedish capitalism has evolved, capital was never entirely at ease with the capital labor compromise that historically obtained there through the Saltsjöbaden agreement. It was capital was always prodding away at that and trying to destabilize that much more than labor ever was, I think. And was chipping away at it and waiting for opportunities to come along to shift the Swedish model much more in the direction of the Anglo type model, which is ultimately what's happened. So that would be my reading, is that capital broadly conceived, I guess one way I put it was it never knows when enough is enough, is I guess what I would put it. And so if there are promises of greater levels of wealth inequality, it will always go for that, irrespective of the fragilities and instabilities that Radhika was referring to. So I say it's a cynical answer, but that for me, that's why it won.
So my question is for Brett. So I have two quick questions. The first one is speaking about recent years, we've seen like relative to like before the pandemic, public money going down, like even in stock markets, in favor of private money, so like private equity and these sorts of things. Do you think that makes the rentier problem even worse? Because at least, we can track stock prices. There's a relative amount of disclosure there. But for private money, I mean, there's practically none, and asset managers can do whatever they want with the numbers. So do you think that, like what would be your take on that? And how do we kind of revert back to maybe getting more money in public money? And my second question would be, it's a bit heretical saying this as a university student, but would you consider a degree as a form of rent and rent seeking? Because thinking about inequality, we've tried to remedy it by democratizing education, so to say, but we haven't seen any effects there. Because at the end of the day, that brings up education costs, and if you can afford that education, have the opportunities, you can, skim off of it, so to say. So what would be your take on that?
I have a question about Lina Khan. Every time I think there's something good happening in US politics, I'm usually disappointed. What she represents seems to be something legitimate and real. My question is, should I be excited about Lina Khan? And can she accomplish any of the things she's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think she seems to be the kind of, as far as you can get, as far as someone who represents something genuinely interesting can make it to a position of relative power, then she does seem to be a very interesting person. And I think, she has the intellectual chops, in terms of, if you read the stuff she was writing 10 years ago and so on about Amazon and so on, is really interesting stuff. And she seems to be kind of, to have the kind of stubbornness and the ability to withstand pretty kind of hostile critique from, not least from the mainstream economics establishment, that you need to be able to, she seems to have good emotional armor, put it that way. So I think, yeah, there's some really interesting stuff going on there. Whether she'll be able to achieve much is an open question. But yeah, it's definitely really interesting. On the questions of, I mean, the rise, obviously the rise of private capital markets as opposed to public capital markets is one of the most interesting phenomena in the capital markets of recent decades, and obviously there's all sorts of reasons for that. I think it used to be one of my, again, relatively simplistic reading, but I think it used to be the case that it was quite difficult for companies to raise significant amounts of capital without going to the public markets. But it's very straightforward now to raise significant amounts of capital privately. So there's, the what you gain from going public is no longer necessary because you can raise that capital privately. And obviously you lose a lot going by public in terms of the ability to hide things, as you said. And so it's very hard to see, given, and Radhika was mentioning about this, given the huge amounts of surplus capital that are swilling around the world, trying to look for a profitable home for investment, unless that changes, it's very hard to see a move back towards the public capital markets. I think that the relative advantages of remaining private are becoming more rather than less important. If you think about oil and gas, for example, the likelihood of major oil and gas exploration and production companies being owned privately, I think, is going to increase in the future, because you can get away with things that it's still reasonably hard to get away with in terms of the public markets. So no, I don't think that's going to reverse anytime soon. And then I'm so tired that I've forgotten your other question. Oh yeah, yeah. I had not really thought of that. I mean, I suppose, I suppose the earlier speaker. I mean, that in a sense, what he was saying, I think you could argue that you could conceive of the narrative that he was presenting precisely in terms of a rent bearing asset. Absolutely. Yeah. But I haven't given it any detailed thought.
We have another online question, Zoom, from Ann Davis. So we're entering a world with increasing military expenditure. What would the implications be for the future of capitalism? Increasing public debt may lead to financial instability or support for the military-industrial complex? That's the question.
I want to add a question too, but maybe before I say that, I think our agenda said we were going to push on until 7 o'clock, but it's been a great day, but it's been a long day. I look out, I see some tired faces. So I think I'll add a question to that, and then maybe we'll hear from both of the speakers, and then we can stop and obviously continue to discuss these issues after we formally end the day. I guess the question I have, stepping back, and I basically think this was Keynes's position, which is that rentier capitalism is essentially what we should expect to see. If you're a capitalist, and I'm not, although I guess maybe I am, because my retirement is with TIAA-CREF. So, but if you're a capitalist and you have the option to put your feet on the desk and clip a coupon and earn a profit, or you have to go out, find wage labor, buy raw materials, figure out a technology and a productive process, combine fixed capital and labor, try to figure out what ultimate demand is in a marketplace, and try to produce a commodity above the cost of production after its final sale. Who wouldn't take option one, right? It just seems kind of crazy. And so when you put it that way, it seems that the Industrial Revolution and the era of modern industry is this really strange contingent moment in the history of capitalism that one has to kind of struggle to explain for contingent reasons. And then once it's over, you kind of go back to the norm, which is wealth owners, property owners, using their power to create the scarcity of assets, extracting rents and income from everybody else. I see one shake of the head because it's a very different kind of conception than one possible kind of Marxist understanding of modern industry as representing a kind of telos of capitalism that then enters in crisis, and that crisis gets displaced, it gets managed, the can gets kicked down the road by financialization, by fictitious capital, by all these kind of different ways of in which rentier capitalism works, you know. And anyway, it seems to me one can make both of those narratives work. And they're both probably true, and they're probably not mutually exclusive. But I be very curious to hear both of our speakers kind of think through them and the implications of one or the other or both. And then we have the question from Rand Davis about military expenditure too. So if you could please take that up.
Well, I guess I'll take your question first, because it goes back to what Daniel was asking. Why conceive of rent and interest as deductions from surplus value? Because, the scenario that, if I put two rabbits in a cage, provided they are of each of the right sex, I will get many rabbits at the end of it. But if I put $2 bills in a cage, the same thing is not going to happen, right? So in that sense, there has to be production. So, somebody has to produce. They are going to get fleeced, but they have to produce for somebody to fleece them, right? That's the key. So we have today in existence structures of power that is allowing a tiny minority to fleece the vast majority. You'd think this is, this should be ripe time for, it's pitchfork time, really. It's socialism time, but it's not happening. That's the key. So anyway, the point is that the reason why people invest is because normally these kinds of opportunities are not available. And that's why you have to invest productively. And this is not an option, by the way, for the vast majority of people. Remember also that the existing financial system it's not an economic system. It's a political system in which some people have more power than others. Some people make more profit than others out of the same events and transactions and so on. For example, somebody mentioned earlier today, pensions. You and I may both have pension plans. But if you look at what happens to pension plans in today's financial world, number one, they are nothing but throwaweight for the top echelons of the financial world to use or to channel in order to exaggerate the price movements out of which they are going to make profits. They're going to make a killing, actually. I shouldn't even call it profits, but anyway, whatever, speculative profits. Number two, when there is a crash, they lose more than the top investors. When there is a boom, they gain less than the top investors. So they are just there as, as I say, essentially to provide the throwaway to exaggerate price movement. So in that sense, the financial system is not a set of economic relationships. It's a set of very political relationships. So anyway, there was one other thing I meant to say, and probably come back to me. Anyway, if I remember later on, I will reply. On the question of the military-industrial complex and war, etc., I'd just like to say that, there is a lot to be understood. It has to do with why the Anglo model won. What were the conditions in which the Anglo model won? And I think it has to do with the United States, as I say, temporary. Remember, many people talk as though the United States was bound to become the overwhelmingly powerful country in the world. This is not true. Yes, already before the First World War, it had become the largest economy in the world. But there was nothing to ensure that it would become larger than all the rest of the world combined, which is what happened at the end of the Second World War. And that would not have happened had it not been for the war, because the war destroyed the rival economies and it boosted the US economy. When President Biden talks about the US being the arsenal of democracy, you guys are putting a halo over essentially the fact that the United States was profiting from selling armaments to Europe. all this time, both in the First World War and in the Second World War. Those, if you plot US growth, there are only two huge spikes in the growth, and they are the two wars. And that's that's one thing. Secondly, the United States emerges from this with a chance to do what it has been wanting to do since the early 20th century, which is to replace Britain. It sees British power is waning, so they think that they can replace Britain. The problem with that desire was that the world had already become multipolar. Its own rise, plus Germany's rise, plus that of many other countries, eventually the Soviet Union, etc. The world had already become multipolar. So the United States was condemned to try to be the leader of the imperialist world in a period when imperialists had already set off on its long-term decline. Its peak was 1914. Since then, it has been declining. I wouldn't say it's been declining with anything like the speed I would like to see, but it has been declining. So, and that was the fate of the United States. The third thing that I would say is that in this process, the United States, after 1971, realized, various people like Charles Kindleberger and others were already theorizing this well before 1971 happened, that the way to prop up the dollar while providing liquidity through deficits, which is subject to the Triffin dilemma, is to essentially vastly increase the amount of financial activity. The United States lifted capital controls in the 70s. It then essentially has since then opened a vast casino. And the downward pressure on the dollar is counteracted by inviting the private money of the world to join this casino. This strategy is also now already facing a lot of obstacles. The Europeans entered this casino in a big way in the 2000s, got very badly burned by what was the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008. It was not a global financial crisis. They got badly burned. They are staying away right now. They're not there, which is why the Federal Reserve has to buy so many treasuries. The treasury market is in big crisis. The United States is now going to issue even more debt. So it's not going to work. So anyway, the point is to come back to this question of war. The United States is waging wars one after another because the United States has no plan B. There is no political leader in the United States which said, look, folks, we tried to dominate the world. We haven't succeeded. Trying further is not going to yield success. We need to learn to make peace with the world and deal cooperatively with the rest of the world. That's the political leadership you need. By the way, Jill Stein is providing that option. Please consider her. Michael and I are working for her anyway. So please consider, she's the only anti-war candidate you've got and the only sensible eco-socialist candidate you've got. So there, she's got plan B.
Yeah, the question you asked, John, isn't like the question we had earlier. Is another of those very, very big questions I definitely don't have a particularly good answer to. I think you're completely right that is basically the Keynesian position, which does make a lot of intuitive sense. And that when you look at it from that angle, the Industrial Revolution does feel like something idiosyncratic, for want of a better word. Based on the reading I've done, it seems to me that we can best think about that moment, for want of a better word, in the history of capitalism, less in terms of kind of like the distinction between the different sets of incentives available to economic actors, that in terms of kind of industrial production on the one hand, or rent-seeking activity on the other, but more in terms of, and I guess I would say this as a geographer, but more in terms of kind of a particular moment in the history of in the historical geography of the world, both internally within European countries in terms of what was happening with enclosure, incipient urbanization on the one hand, and then external in terms of the relationship with empire and slavery on the other. And that I think that's the way to understand that particular moment, is in that way, as the kind of confluence of a unique set of developing conditions in terms of the historical geography of the world, and that's the way to understand it, is in a very materialistic, almost geographical sense. That would be my inclination.
Great. So thank you to our speakers, our organizers, and everyone who's attended the day. And thank you all.
We'll just take one moment. Thank you, John, for moderating. Well, I don't know if we're in feudalism, capitalism, neo-feudalism, but I know I learned a lot with this conference. I hope everyone has too. I'd like to take one moment just to thank our presenters again. Thank you, the invited speakers. Thank all the moderators. Thank the sponsors again. Thank you, the audience. Thank you to those who participated via Zoom. Thanks especially to Joe Bonney and the AV team. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to transmit this via Zoom. We had this issue. Thanks, y'all. This was a hardware issue. There was nothing we could do about it. I'd like to thank my fellow organizers, co-organizers once again. Thank you especially Daniel, Nico, Stephen Cunniff, who was here quiet all the time, but he was the one who took care of finances, logistics, catering, everything. So none of this would have been possible without him. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Chris Hong, also, who couldn't join us, but he also helped us a lot with the conference. And I hope you all have a great evening. Thanks.